Hey all, we are back. Oh, this where the chat is. I gotta do something about this. All right. Hopefully that's better. Covering too much of my beautiful face. Maybe I can just move it off screen, off of the actual picture there. I don't know. Maybe that looks too weird. Eh, don't worry about it. We're back. It's a great day. We're into very well into summer now. I love the summer. It's warm out. Gets dark late. Just had some really good watermelon. Ooh, it's great. Uh, no tea today. Decided to just go with ice water. Another, another I don't know, weird quirk of summers. Somehow, cold water tastes better. I don't know. It's just kind of a weird thing that goes on. Um, but that said, today, uh, I got a. Well, I guess I didn't get it today, but I had a request to watch something by someone, and I figured, you know what? I'll watch it on stream. It seems like it's kind of interesting. I was pitched that this is a debate on the subject of is philosophy necessary, or do we really need philosophy? But the debate I can find with these people is which is more important, science or philosophy, um, or which is best, I guess. Uh, so yeah, let's start getting into it. So I guess I'll discuss both concepts at once, right? Or both questions as that I was posed at once. So we titled the stream is philosophy necessary, and I think it's a reasonable time to start talking about this because it's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people write off. But hopefully we've seen why it is necessary. Sometimes people will come up with like pseudo philosophical arguments, like we saw in the last couple of days, and also with Dr. Regardus. Um, and sometimes, but even beyond that, like we can do philosophy on our own to help us answer some difficult questions. Things like abortion, stem cell research, um, a lot of the like ethics questions. Well, ethics is very specifically a branch of philosophy. uh, I'm trying to remember what the five main branches are. I think there's like another one. I was taught there were five, and there was one other one. I'm like, oh, I guess that is a branch. But if I remember correctly, it's metaphysics. And so when I talk about philosophy, I'm talking about a couple of things. One, I'm talking about the like original idea, love of wisdom, right? There is this like kind of sense you get of that kind of approach of just like I'm really interested in like learning and asking questions, and sometimes this takes a lot of forms. Like Socrates was well known for just asking people what is justice and then interrogating their answer until they got annoyed at him. That isn't a way doing philosophy. He's asking, what do we mean by this thing? You might call that metaphysics. It's a kind of close. Maybe semantics would be that sixth category. I would call it. Uh, Metaphysics is like what is, right? Like, and oh, sorry, I'm jumping around because I'm trying to like organize all my thoughts. ADD brain. We will restructure. Okay. So that's one of the things I'm talking about. I'm also talking about like the idea of generating interesting and important questions. I think that is the main purpose of philosophy to my mind. Sometimes you can answer those questions, and the better you're able to answer those questions, the more it stops being science and starts being philosophy. As a reminder, in case anyone is unaware, uh, science didn't used to be called science. Newton, for example, was considered and called himself a natural philosopher. I think Darwin did too, because some of these branches, like biology, at some point had to be invented as a concept. If I'm not mistaken, that was a long time ago. Maybe not the word itself, but Aristotle, if I remember correctly, did a lot. It was like very, very interested in what we would now call biology. So it's not like this is a new phenomenon, but he was a philosopher, right? He was asking questions, interesting questions about like, okay, well, what's with all the similarities that we see between animal species? What are the commonalities? How can we sort and divide them and understand them in groups? These are questions that later biologists got very good about answering and continue to try to answer. But before we were able to answer this particularly well, it was just a good question. And I think that's the primary thing philosophy does for society, is that philosophy ought to ask good questions. Also, uh, well, but there are also areas where philosophy is the only branch of, I mean, as of yet at least, that branch of thought that can answer some of those questions. Questions of ethics are never going to have scientific rigor to them because there is an element of subjectivity always, right? This is something that I think a lot of scientists miss. And it's an advanced form of the is-ought fallacy. Is this understanding of like, well, we know it is the case that this will happen, and there's no philosophical questions you can ask that change that. It's like, well, that's true, but the there is no there is no answer to why that is good or bad. A really good example is like I could, maybe not me personally, but people know they can tell you with scientific accuracy sets of policies that would increase the number of people who are able to vote. At a minimum, I could tell you some of them. Like I could tell a really easy one would be like, what if the voting age was reduced to 10? Maybe that's not a good idea, but I could tell you for sure more people would be able to vote. Or we could, if vote election day were a holiday, that would be a good idea in my opinion. Then people would be better able to vote. Or if everyone got issued, or if there were enough polling stations where you didn't have to wait in line for hours. There are a lot of these policies that you could know for certain without any ambiguity, any questions whatsoever, will absolutely 100% definitely increase the number of people who are able to vote and end up voting. What you cannot do is tell me why more people voting is good. Not with a scientific. It is a subjective position, and so questions like that are things that only really philosophy can address. And then, of course, there's also the academic discipline of philosophy, which these are overlapping. These are not mutually exclusive spheres. These are overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. Academic philosophy divided into, as I understand it, five, maybe I would call it six branches. Those being metaphysics, the question of like what is real. Uh, Taken literally, meta means after. Physics. It was literally just in Aristotle's writings. I think it was in his lecture notes. If I remember right, there aren't a lot of records. My phone is blowing up right now. As soon as I start streaming, are they telling me that my audio is bad or something? No. Okay, cool. uh, if I as I understand it, we don't have a lot of writings from Aristotle except for lecture notes, but we have a ridiculous amount of lecture notes, is my understanding. And it's just like when organized, there was the physics, and then there was the stuff that was like it's not really physics. It's like what is this? Well, we'll put it after the physics. That was metaphysics. And so when you ask things like is reality real, philosophy is much more useful for lawyers than science. I think. I disagree, Peachy Keen, and I will come back to that. So like what is real is one of those typical questions. This is the one that like a lot of people who first get into philosophy struggle with a lot, and where they'll say like, well, how can I know anything's real? Like you never can really prove anything. How do you ever get past that? And the ultimate answer is you just get past it. Like it just stops bothering you very very quickly. It's really not that big a deal. Especially because you realize that nothing there is that kind of expectation is a little bit unreasonable to the extent to which you can't technically ever actually prove anything. To our own satisfactions, for practical purposes, we can, and so it's fine. This is part of why a friend of mine, I've said this a few times, calls metaphysics now what philosophy, of like, okay, reality isn't real, cool. Now what? What do we do? How does my life change in any meaningful way when I say reality? If I've determined reality isn't real, all sorts of stuff like this. This is also where you'd find. This is always where you find like, is God real? That has much more impact because the answer to that question is something that a lot of people stake their lives on, right? So that's metaphysics. There's also ethics. That one's pretty simple. What is good? How should we act? And there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, including like meta ethics, like how do we approach the idea of approaching ethics or whatever. Uh, there's logic, the study of like how do logical things work. Some of the most interesting things I've ever learned about were from logic courses. Reading just a couple of pages that were a synopsis of what Aristotle came to understand about logic were some of the most eye-opening things I've ever read. Just a couple of pages, but it was really really interesting of how to approach like how do I demonstrate logical principles without being able to rely on them to demonstrate what I'm talking about. And it was very interesting. Also, uh, the first instance where we'll see a counterpoint to you, Peachy Keen, is that Boolean logic, which is or also known as symbolic logic, is a philosophical concept. It's a method of basically turning logic into math in some ways. It's not ubiquitous, but you can do this a lot. Is like the basis for computer programming, right? And you should know this, Peachy Keen, right? That computer logic is literally Boolean logic. They think the exact same way as the rules laid out in there. And so that you start to see this usefulness of like, well, when you have this thorough an understanding of logic, you can do a lot of stuff, like literally what I'm doing right now. Like streaming is impossible without Boolean logic and without the computer systems that are built on it. We got through three, right? Metaphysics, ethics, and logic. There's also aesthetics. What is beautiful? That has never been like terribly interesting to me, but you know it is what it is. I'm blinking on the fifth one. Maybe I should just look it up. I'm sorry, Daria. We don't need your picture anymore. Epistemology. How could I miss epistemology? Epistemology is how do we know what we know, and what does knowing things mean? This is where you get distinctions between someone. If someone says I know this, you might say no, you don't know it. You think you know it because it ends up being wrong. There's a lot of stuff that goes into epistemology. When epistemology gets really good, when it gets really concrete, that's when you start seeing things like what are like best educational practices. How best do we teach people? Because we understand how people learn and how people know things. I guess see, ontology feels like it'd be part of metaphysics to me. But then the last one I would say is semantics. How do we know things? So like that like academic discipline is also what we mean by philosophy. That has a lot of uses as well because it concretizes into sciences. And this is Peachy Keen is my response to you, is that philosophy is the grandfather of all academic understanding, with the possible exceptions of mathematics, maybe, because early mathematicians were philosophers, and art, maybe. But every other discipline is descended from philosophy in some way. As I said, probably before you popped in, Peachy Keen, a lot of science just used to be philosophy until we started better able to answer those questions that they raised. Newton, we would now call a physicist, was a philosopher. He was called a natural philosopher. And so if you like permute out everyone who has done something that we now call science, well then yeah, philosophy becomes useless. But that's also because you permuted out all the things that have been of use. That's also, by the way, not even true. There are instances where we don't realize we're doing philosophy all the time. And the reason why I'm going on at length about this is because I've also heard prominent scientists talk about how philosophy is useless. And most noteworthy to my mind is Lawrence Krauss, who has gone on at length about like how philosophy is useless, and he'll always ask philosophers, what contribution to knowledge has philosophy made in the last 50 years? Just name one, and I'll get off your back, because he can point to lots of things, lots of contributions to knowledge that science has provided. Now, of course, the common answer is that he's asking the wrong question, and I agree. That's not necessarily what philosophy is for. Philosophy is for asking the question. Answering the question is more often for science. However, philosophy does make contributions to knowledge, just not kinds of knowledge that he would really think about. You could talk about as a different approach to ethics as being a contribution to knowledge. You can talk about you can there are modern philosophers who have talked about like what certain like political philosophies are. So like Umberto Eco's paper on fascism, that would be a contribution to knowledge that is philosophical, at least in part, in nature. Because remember, political philosophy is philosophy. Um, Political science, I would, maybe even, maybe political science. I don't know how far they get into whatever. I'm not going to go into that too much. But also, even scientists do this thing, because Lawrence Krauss, in his book A Universe from Nothing, to which I listened to the audiobook, and I'd heard him talk about it a lot, got a lot of flack because he redefined the word nothing. Right? When you say like, can a whole universe come from nothing? Well, first you have to know what nothing is, right? And he said, well, we can say that nothing is the absence of something, right? If you don't have any something, then you have nothing, right? This is a bit different than how it's been typically defined, which is um, a complete, like a absolute negation of anything. There is not anything, right? He's saying like, well, if we get rid of all the anything we could call something, then we have nothing, right? And so he starts stripping away things like, okay, we can get rid of all matter, but then you have still space time. Okay, we can get rid of all space time and know what properties there are, and we can even get rid of the laws of physics as though that's like something. And he goes further and further. He's gotten pushback on this, I think, from a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about, but anyone who does know what they're talking about, it's going to be way over my head to evaluate. The point is, however, that when he was defining nothing and making clear what we mean by that and what we should and could mean, and what makes sense to mean by saying can we get a universe from nothing, what we mean by that is an act of philosophy. That is what he was doing. He was better understanding the term. You could call that semantics as the branch, or maybe metaphysics. But there is a concrete use by a scientist using philosophy, because science can never tell you what nothing ought to mean. It can only tell you what like it can tell you details about what you've defined that thing as, right? Or it can tell you, it can inform your understanding of what we mean by something. So philosophy in my mind is very useful, but often for different reasons than people think that it could be. Now, as I understand it, this is a very funny debate, and so I don't necessarily think they're going to take this seriously. My guess is that this is going to be like, sparring of like, my discipline's better, my discipline's better. I would honestly, if I'm being like, I don't know what the right word is here. If I'm being not just honest, but um, if I'm taking into consideration origins and whatever, I would call science a branch of philosophy. Because, as I say, you get to questions of science when you start to answer questions that are posed by philosophers. Psychology is another really good example. 200 years ago, psychology wasn't a thing. Only it was philosophers of the mind who would probe and ask questions, and like, what could you do with, and like, what are people like, and how does the brain work, and how do personalities, and you have all these like weird ideas. But they started to concretize their answers, starting to find more real world evidence, things like that. And suddenly you get people like Freud and Jung, and the entire discipline bursts forth from there. So clearly, I think philosophy is important, and we do still need it, because there are questions that are in a way unanswerable, or at the very least need constant updating, particularly questions of ethics. What is, like, as we saw yesterday, the discussion of what is a woman is a question of, well, both semantics, but also ethics and a little bit metaphysics. And that is a question that's only really started to be asked in public fairly recently. Now, it's been an issue well before the more the before it was brought to the forefront more recently, before there was more more of a spotlight on trans issues. Trans people have been around for a very long time, but now we're talking about these issues, and now we can start to answer these questions. And that's an update that was necessary because, 50 years ago, that would have been a ridiculous question, and the answer would have been very bad. Whereas now we can start to update, and so we still need it. The question as to whether which is better, science or philosophy, I think is it's just a silly question. I don't think they're in intent to take it seriously. Um, if I would be forced to answer it, I would say science is a branch of philosophy. Therefore, philosophy, I guess. You're asking in a way like about a subsect. It's like which is better, uh, video games or World of Warcraft? And it's like, well, World of Warcraft is a video game, right? Like, or like less broad, maybe like what's better, uh, novels or science fiction? Well, okay, both are subsections of another thing, but science fiction is a type of novel. Is it how could it be better or worse? It's just a type of that thing. That's how I look at it. Science has obviously unique it obviously has unique aspects to it that philosophy doesn't. Things like a scientific method and peer review and things like this that don't really make sense in philosophy outside of science. But it's just the subsection has more details. What I do want to contrast though a little bit, and I understand the frustration, is that I understand the frustrations of people like Lawrence Krauss with the way academic philosophy is done. Oftentimes, the body of knowledge. Oh, I hear some gardening happening outside. Give me one moment. Let me close my window. Never mind. I was ahead of the game. My window was already closed. As I was saying, the way academic philosophy is done, I can't speak too much to the higher levels, though I know there are people who have had a lot of issues with it. Um, it's often taught, as I mentioned before, kind of like gospel. You don't encourage people to do the thinking, or maybe you'll encourage people, but that's not how the class is taught. It's not taught from a perspective of how to do the thinking. It is read these dusty tomes written in such dense, indiscernible language that it's truly a pain to get through, even if you find it interesting, and understand that these are what people thought. But it's much less important what people thought than understanding how to utilize those ideas and to think yourself. Critical thinking, I think, is the heart of philosophy, and it is, from what I've seen, underemphasized. Even though there are like critical thinking courses and like there are courses where like the professors will encourage like discussion and debate and whatever. Oftentimes you're just presented with like here's what Rene Descartes said, and unless someone speaks up, no one you're not really going to get much past that. And so it, you know it's very easy for someone to just be like, well, philosophy is this set of things that people say. And it's confusing too because a lot of these philosophers are in disagreement with each other, but you're not taught to like engage in the conversation. You're taught only to understand and memorize what these people said. Kind of like it's more taught like the history of philosophy than the practice. It's like if you went to a science class and all they did was teach you what other scientists have learned and never about the scientific method. You might say that's a thing that happens, and yeah, that's a problem, But like any scientist would recognize that's a problem, and that's not how it should be done. You should be there's an amount to which it is important and necessary to know what has been determined or what has been thought or considered, or like what has happened prior in this discipline. But it's not the heart of the discipline. The heart of the discipline is doing it, and the same is true for philosophy. So we'll see what these people have to say about it. My guess is this is going to be kind of jokey. So maybe we'll finish, maybe we won't. But let's get into it. Peter Atkins, as I understand, will be on the philosophy side, and Stephen Law will be on the science side. But I imagine they'll let us know. So this is the World Humanist Congress in Oxford. I think they're both Oxford professors. I'm not sure. Let's get into it. Okay, so we're getting a clearer question here. Science or philosophy, which is the best model for free inquiry? Honestly, I would say neither. Um, neither or both. As I say, science, I would consider kind of a subsection of philosophy. But even if you don't say that, they seek to do different things, both of which are highly important, as I've gone over. Right, asking the question is often as important or more important than determining the answer. But often, especially with a bad question, it is not helpful at all. Like, obviously there are definitely bad questions that are not helpful to be asked. Like, what skull bumps affect different races' ability uh, for art or whatever. And it's like, that's a bad question. You're assuming so much in the and that question, it is not helpful to answer because there are no coherent answers. A better question would be, do skull bumps affect the brain in any way? To which you immediately find the answer is no, and then you move on.
So, on to our first workshop of the Congress. Science or philosophy, which is the best model for free inquiry? So thank you so much for coming along.
I guess in a way, philosophy is better suited for free inquiry because the whole point is to ask questions, right? Whereas I guess that's a very silly. Even as I'm saying it, I disagree with what I was just saying, even in the
The
silliness.
love of wisdom and the pursuit of knowledge. And Aristotle was not alone in the ancient world.
Okay, we can skip the preamble. We usually do, right? We won't get their introductions as to who exactly these people are, but it's about the ideas, right? Who cares who they are? That's another thing. Your argument does not become more correct because Kant said it. It becomes more correct because you can demonstrate its veracity. Um, and even if no one had said it before, if you can argue for your point, it wouldn't matter, right? And so this is another issue that I have, both in competitive debate and philosophy in general. Though I think it's worse in competitive debate. Just because someone important said it doesn't mean they're right. You have to make the argument, and if you're going to quote them, you should demonstrate why they're right. In fact, you should, yeah. Well, I'm not going to go into it. Like, the citation of someone in a competitive debate shouldn't be, here's what they said. It should be, well, they came up with the argument, so I am citing them so as to give credit to that argument, but I'm going to express their argument and demonstrate that that's the argument they were making, as opposed to what is actually done, which is just like, well, this person said this. Unfortunately, the difficulty is that sometimes a philosopher will take an entire book to make a point that could be said in a paragraph, and so to like find quotes other than just the conclusion is very difficult. So instead, you should make the argument.
I thought Stephen was going to go first, so I was just going to attack what he said. So
Fair.
I've been set up quite clearly. I do apologise. I also apologise for the title.
Can you all hear all right? Let me know if the audio's okay.
Comparative
I know
depth.
it's kind of an old video and in a less than ideal environment, but hopefully
Yes,
it's
the bureaucracy
okay.
out of the way. Yes, philosophy is good for free inquiry, provided you emphasize the free. That is, so long as you're not constrained by evidence.
Okay, that's really funny, but I can't imagine agreeing with that statement. I guess maybe let's hear him elaborate. Oh my.
To explore wherever your thoughts take you. This, of course, comes.
Oh, okay, with that added, like, free to go wherever your thoughts take you. Yeah, like, that's kind of the heart of philosophy, but there's some amount of it where it's just nonsense of, like, okay, well, like, if you're wondering of, like, I wonder, is there some supernatural force that causes rivers to flow away from the ocean? Well, like, okay, the evidence that rivers don't flow away from the ocean, in fact flow towards, seems pretty relevant there actually. To that question. Your questions stop making sense when they are not, at the very least, somewhat in alignment with what we observe of reality. This is why I think science and philosophy go hand in hand. Philosophy asks the question that science is often better at answering, and then when science has answered that question, it better informs the philosopher as to the state of what is actually true about the world to ask the next more interesting question.
out in the worst possible way when theology becomes a way.
Oh, and like someone like Krauss would say, like, well, no, the philosopher doesn't answer the question, the scientist answers it. The scientist asks the question. That's what a hypothesis is. But he's looking at it. That would be a very narrow scope, because because what I'm talking about is like answering the next most interesting question. I'm talking about the new branch of science that gives way from that. We already had biology when philosophers started becoming psychologists and studying instead the mind instead of just like life. You could call psychology kind of a subsect of biology because it refers to living things, the minds of living things. And so they ask the next question, which is, and they might not happen sequentially, right? The questions of the mind predated, I think, questions of biology. It was just the only example I could come to mind. That came to mind for me.
When philosophy becomes theology, where inventions are made which are then pursued down the ages, and I think that's a clear example of an example where free inquiry is iniquitous. That's about all I've got to say, I think.
Oh, come on, you've got to be able to do better than that.
An example, I suppose, of where free inquiry, loosely and interpreted, I think, in a way that maybe Stephen is likely to interpret it, is inappropriate without appealing to evidence, is exemplified by the Greek philosophers, to whom we should show a great deal of pleasure and honour, because they did start humanity thinking, and I think that was rather wonderful. But of course, that's all.
This is, as I understand it, a bit of a Eurocentric view of the world. As I understand it, philosophy had been going on for quite a while in Asia as well, but maybe we don't have as many records of, but we just don't talk about it as much.
People like Aristotle sat around on marble steps.
And I would argue that philosophy has been going on well before the idea of philosophy, like the understanding of what philosophy is, started coming about. I mean, even at a minimum, Socrates coined the term, but there are the pre-Socratics. But even beyond that, it's kind of in the same way Aristotle was doing biology before there was such a thing as biology. The processes of human thought and asking these interesting questions, I mean, they must have been going on for ages before writing, so we'll never know where it really started. We just know the first person to call himself a philosopher was supposedly Socrates, and we begin the tradition. We look at the beginning of the tradition as being there.
What the world was probably like, should be like, is like, without appealing to any evidence whatsoever. Not quite true in biology, of course, where he was rather more carefully attuned to evidence, but certainly in physics. And such was his grip on humanity's inclination to understand that his errors persisted for millennia. And I think that's an example of where free inquiry without evidence can be extremely damaging. The joy of science, and it is a joy of science, is that mankind has stumbled on the most obvious way of thinking.
Right, this is completely off topic, but I found a brief history of philosophy, and we're going to derail to look at it. I think it's absolutely wonderful. Whoops. Oh no. Did I lose it? Sorry. I lost it real quick. Alright. Brief history of philosophy. Oh no, why is it just not copying the thing? Oh no. Computer, please. Why? Why you do this? Ooh, why is it not pasting? Okay, there we go. A brief history of philosophy. Aristotle, what does it mean to be a good person? Descartes, what does it mean to be? Nietzsche, what does it mean? Bertrand Russell, what does it mean? C.S. Lewis, what does it? Lil Jon, what? Okay. I know my impression's bad, but no, I just love this. It's very silly. But like, these are what I mean about like some of these questions. Some of this is some of these you need a little more context to understand what that question is. But to be clear, most of these are, as I understand it, these are accurate representations of some of the thoughts of these people. And yeah, these are reasonable questions. And then we get as far as what? I love that meme.
What is going on? Make notes, compare notes, and perhaps most important of all, to embed the notes and observations in a reticulation of phenomena, a reticulation, a network.
I will say I am overwhelmed by like the stuffy Britishness that is on display
No
here.
part of science is an island.
No disrespect or whatever, just
And I
like,
think
whew.
we should remember that. Discoveries in one part of science, discoveries that almost invariably are made on the basis of observation edginess further forward, never clash with observations made elsewhere in science. One set of observations, let us say in cosmology, informs the observations in, let us say, particle physics.
That's a weird statement because as I understand it, that's just not true. We've gone over already how like Newton's laws are at odds with quantum physics and relativistic physics. And like there needed to be a like kind of a unifying principle. Like there was a clash, and that was the whole point of Einstein's thought experiments. Was like he noticed that he understood that there was a clash, and he had to solve that question. So like it's kind of a weird point. It's even weird to me to present the case for philosophy as opposed to science, as opposed to just like talking about its own merits, as I did at length before we got into this. But maybe because it's the context of a debate that's why he's doing it this way. Strange, very strange to me.
Magnitude. And it's quite extraordinary how science, and more generally, how understanding of the nature of the world edges forward on the basis of relating observation to this reticulation of existing concepts. You can see an effect of that in the way that philosophy has slowly lost any area in which it used to be dominant. Of course, it used to be dominant in
Yeah,
theology.
that is something I do notice as well. Is like it seems now like all of the edges of all the corners of understanding have been filled in with scientific disciplines. It seems there isn't this like obvious thing that philosophy handles that science doesn't, like things like the psyche. But maybe that's just because we haven't had thinkers who ask the right questions, who find those disciplines, but also because science now is self-sustaining, and so new disciplines can arise from it as opposed to from philosophy. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but there are also things that philosophy is uniquely for that science can never be.
Theology is nonsense, and most philosophers accept that it's nonsense unless they're paid by one church or the other. But serious philosophers, like secular philosophers, know that theology has really been taken away from their domain. Science in general, the objects of scientific inquiry, which used once to be part of the domain of philosophy, natural philosophy of course, they've lost that. No scientist these days listens to what philosophers have to say.
It's not entirely true either. They just might not do it in a way that informs their work, or not realize it. Because like ethics is a philosophical discipline, even as much as like there's like ethics advisory boards for science experiments and whatever. Like those they're doing philosophy as they plan their experiment with the considerations for ethical considerations in mind. It's just not But like no, they don't go to like A.C. Grayling, who's a prominent philosopher. I don't know if he's still working, but he's a friend of mine's favorite philosopher, and he's contemporary. Like you can, like I watched a debate of his only like something like 8 years ago. He's still alive as I understand it. They don't like go ask him like how to do their experiments or whatever else, but they science is still informed in some way by philosophy, even if it's not in ways that are quite as obvious.
My classification, like of philosophers and scientists, is that philosophers are almost invariably pessimists, whereas scientists are almost invariably optimists.
That is kind of true, yeah.
Philosophers say you cannot tread there, you will never understand. Scientists, largely ignoring these sheet anchors of philosophy, goes into the laboratory, does some work, and then shows to the philosopher what they thought could never be done. And we know that there are big open questions, extraordinarily difficult questions, which philosophers think that, and indeed many assert, it will never be within our capability of resolving, such as the origin of the universe, such as the nature of consciousness. Don't listen to them.
No, yeah, as I understand it, that's something that's being worked on.
Of the optimism
yeah, we might get there. Maybe not within our lifetimes, but
of scientists.
It's the beauty of scientific inquiry.
And there is no reason to suppose, other than pessimism, that we will not get there.
Why is he making the case for science right now?
The domains of inquiry and philosophy are falling away because they do not have the key to truth. The key to truth is evidence. And it's your turn to...
Is it already?
Wait, what the hell was that? He basically just made the case for science. He was supposed to be the philosophy side. I don't understand.
Right. Okay, well, I thought what I would do is just, as a philosopher, explain what I think philosophy is.
Oh, maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it was the other way around.
An important activity. Let me begin by tipping my hat, as philosophers often do, to science.
Oh, my mistake. Okay, I guess I got it all turned around. I thought that was the philosophy guy first. I guess that was the science guy first. In which case, all of his arguments made a lot more sense now. And we've already heard my thoughts on that. Okay, my bad.
Saying very clearly at the outset that if you want to find out about how things stand...
Hello, this is such an interesting debate. Thanks for covering it. Yeah, it seemed interesting to me. I think you missed at the outset, Galit, my full thoughts on the matter. If you want to just go watch the VOD later or something.
Is one of the very best methods available in terms of discovering how things stand. I rather doubt that you're going to discover anything about how things stand out there in reality by sitting in your armchair with your eyes closed, having a good old think about it. And that is Peter's concern, and he's right, of course, that's true. So
that's also not what we're trying to do.
Roll over and concede that philosophy is a waste of time then? Well, because that's just a misunderstanding of what philosophy is. That's why. So let me just explain what I think philosophy is. Science addresses many questions, but there are...
Oh, it's okay, Galit. Just like I said, I don't want to go over it again because I went on for like a half hour, but like if you want to just watch the video later.
Here to be questions that are questions that are beyond the remit of science, of the empirical sciences to answer. And, you can think of your own examples, but classic examples would be, for example, why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing?
I actually hate that question. I think it's profoundly... I think it's nonsense. Because it asks a why question when there might not be a why. Or I guess there are two kinds of whys. There's why as in how come, and there's why in terms of what for. I don't think the what for question is necessarily meaningful. The what for question could only be really like because God or whatever, but like the how come question, that's a scientific question. Yeah, I actually don't think that's a very good question, personally.
Philosophical conundrum. Can science answer that fundamental question? Well, of course, scientists can point to the
Well, that depends on how we mean it, right? Like, science can absolutely, or at the very least, they're attempting to answer the question is, how did it come to be that there is something rather than nothing? Um, like for what caused that to be the case, right? That is one way we mean the question why, but the question of like for what reason or for what purpose did the universe come to be? I don't know that there isn't. I don't think there is an answer to that question, and no, science couldn't answer it but I don't think anyone could.
Big Bang. They can say we've discovered that Big Bang happened 13 or 14 billion years ago.
And it assumes that there is an answer to that question by asking it, right?
Of course, that really postpones the question, doesn't it? The mystery of why there's something rather than nothing.
Not
Because we're now
really.
able to know, well, why did the Big Bang happen rather than not? Perhaps other theories will develop.
Right, and then you
Perhaps
could
there'll
find
be
the
a
cause or
theory
whatever.
of quantum vacuums in which the Big Bang happens as a spontaneous event, given the pre-existing quantum conditions.
Oh, and by the way, in that novel, or sorry, not novel, in that book I told you about earlier from Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing, he argues that it is inevitable that in the condition, like that with the conditions of nothingness as he describes, that universes will spring into existence. Um, Obviously, that's science way above my head, and my guess is that it's not so certain as to say definitively, but at the very least, there is that consideration at the moment.
Perhaps that would explain it, but then we just want an explanation for those pre-existing quantum conditions, don't we? Scientific explanations work like this. They point to laws or causes that account for...
What he's pointing at is that he can point to an infinite regress of causes, which is, I think, a bad argument.
Explanation of why the water in your pipes froze last Thursday. The scientist will say, it is the law of nature that water freezes below 0 degrees centigrade. The temperature fell below 0 degrees centigrade last Tuesday. Hence, the water froze in your pipes last Tuesday. That is a scientific explanation, perfectly good one. But you can see that if that's how scientific explanation works, when it comes to the most fundamental laws and most fundamental causes...
It's hard to hear the speaker. Yeah, that's what I was asking about. Let me turn it up a bit. Since you're watching a video from humanists, what do you think about Sam Harris's version of humanism, i.e. evolutionary humanism, evolved ethics, as I would call it? I would want to appraise his position more directly. I'm not sure exactly what he says about this stuff. I've watched Sam Harris a bit, but this was some years ago, and some of what he talked about I agree is like kind of nonsense when he talks about like when he has his like positions on objective ethics and the way I think it's an interesting approach, and I'm glad someone made an attempt and that like this attempt in this way exists, but I don't think it works. That said, that might not be what you're talking about, so I'm not sure that I'm answering your question well. If you want to shoot me a video that I can go over on some later stream, I'd be happy to do that. But I don't know his position well enough, I think, on what you're talking about to really talk about it too much. Humanism, as I understand it, like broad concept is the idea that like we should, as opposed to being preferential to particular groups or whatever, but like to seek the maximum flourishing of the human species. I'm like generally sympathetic to that position. I hope in future that will be considered a regressive belief and that like the species divide will also be overcome. But I'm also not even sure that that's what he's talking about. So yeah, if you want to shoot me a video, either chat, comments, email, I'd be very happy to go over it and find out what he thinks about this stuff. But I don't know enough right now to really say too much.
As a brute fact, or we will have to look for some other kind of explanation for them. And it's those kind of questions then that philosophers are particularly interested in. Theologians too, of course, they'll be reaching for God at that point. I'm not amongst them, I'm a philosopher. It seems to me that the project of philosophy is to attempt to answer these questions as best we can by applying reason. That's not to say that we will necessarily succeed, but we might be able to...
I don't really disagree with that view, that like do the best we can with it. And then like I guess when we were very well able to answer the question, then it starts to become a science. I don't hate that view, but as I said earlier, I view philosophy more as about asking the question than answering it.
And no good, and it seems to me that we can figure out pretty quickly that the theological ones are no good, and that, it seems to me, would be some philosophical progress. Another
Oh, that's a
area
reasonable
which,
point. Yeah, like to
seems me that
reject
science
other ideas.
quickly
Yeah.
runs out of steam is morality. David Hume famously invoked the is-ought gap.
Yep,
Science
very
discovers
important.
what is the case. It discovers that there is blood and that there is screaming and so on. There is pain, there is suffering. But in an argument, premises that concern what is the case always fail logically to support conclusions about what one ought or ought not to do. And yet morality is concerned with what one ought or ought not to do. Therefore, science cannot justify moral positions or moral conclusions.
Yeah, and like this is something that like people talk about a lot. I've already mentioned, but you had me reminded now, Green Flag, about Sam Harris's view on this because he talks about because what he seems to do with his like view of objective ethics and like scientific ethics is not factor in the idea of the intersubjective. Basically, people already know the objective is what is true outside, irrespective of human understanding or feeling or whatever. An objective fact might be like the speed of light has absolutely nothing to do with like my feelings on the matter. Though to be fair, what we call light and where we draw the lines, that could be. I argue that is subjective, a subjective categorization, but that's not the point. Whereas the subjective would be things that things like I feel like this is the case. With ethics in particular, we can say that a subjective statement would be that it is good for more people to be able to vote. I think that is a true statement, but that's that is technically subjective. Intersubjective is that this is kind of a weird something that is intersubjective is something that is ubiquitous but still subjective. So a good example, at the very least, that's my understanding of it. So a good example of something that's intersubjective would be something like murder being wrong. For the most part, people are in agreement about that. But it's not an objective statement. It is more just that it is so ubiquitous that it might as well be. And so this is the intersubjective. It's subjective, but across people or across conscious minds. And I think that's the very clear mistake that Sam Harris makes with his like objective ethics thing. Though I'm not even sure that that's what you're talking about. I was just reminded because he was talking about this is-odd gap, which you talked about already.
At least not the most fundamental positions that we take. Of course, science has a role within moral debate, because very often the conclusions we draw are a combination, draw on premises that are both moral premises and empirical premises. So, for example, I might believe that women ought not to have the vote. I don't believe that, by the way. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, I believe women ought not to have the vote. Why do I believe that? Well, because I believe that women are dim, and dim people ought not to have the vote.
By the way, like it's funny to do it in this way, but when he had that worry of like, by the way, I don't believe this. This is why you approach it by doing the other thing. Maybe you could say, maybe I believe that women ought to have the vote, and then you very easily like, yeah, I do believe that, by the way, and I think that because they're not demons or whatever. Very easy, very easy to not have that worry about like, I guess in a sense, clipping, even though that's not his. Obviously, he's not worried about getting clipped. It's more just taking that out of context. Very easy to get around that.
Dim people ought not to be able to vote. The other premise is that women are dim. That premise
we said dim, not
is
demons. Excuse me.
Falsifiable and indeed empirically falsified, and scientists can establish that, and so they can establish that my conclusion doesn't follow. So it's not that science is irrelevant when it comes to moral
It
argument.
informs the
It is
thoughts.
relevant, but science cannot, it seems, justify our most fundamental moral beliefs because of this famous is-ought gap. So, I'm not signing up to scientism, which is the view that science can answer every legitimate question. It seems to me
that, by the way, the concept of scientism is something that I kind of rejected for a while. Mostly, I think it's in part because I always heard it being used pretty disingenuously from religious apologists. I was going to say Christian apologists, but not exclusively. I've heard it from Muslim and Jewish apologists as well. But more and more, I do feel like I see scientism here and there, where it's that science is like the only source of information and knowledge, and I don't think that's really true. there are certain things that just aren't scientific. It depends on what you mean by science. Lawrence Krauss, I've heard say like science is basically anything that uses uh, observation as part of it. It's like, well, okay, well then sure, but like though. And like yeah, like I don't know how you could know something without any sort of observation. Fine, but that's obviously not what science means. Um, and like more and more, I do think there are people who are like fall into like scientism, uh, as a outlook.
These are perfectly good and legitimate questions, and it seems to me that in some cases it is in principle impossible for science to answer those questions. Those are the questions that
Information can be
philosophers
obtained by
and
informal
philosophers
science.
tend to focus on.
I mean, you could like sure that's true, but like an example I gave earlier is like is the subject of semantics, right? I argued that Lawrence Krauss was doing philosophy by defining the word nothing in his book. That I would not call science, even informal science, even if you have to like do like I don't know, like I guess you don't really observe anything in the like even maybe that even skirts like that, but like semantic understandings or ethical understandings um or just like I don't know what's a good example. Uh, like I don't know. I can't think of a third example, but like some of these are sources of at the very least understanding, if not if you don't want to say it rises to the level of knowledge that come from something other than science and sometimes other than observation even. Because that's another thing. Like you can make meaningful contributions to understanding, like talking about like how like the like an emotional effect that something had, and the way you would observe it is noticing that like it made you feel a certain way. But is that science? I don't think so.
Um, Let me then talk about how we might approach these kind of puzzles. What method might we apply? Well, it seems to me that philosophers are essentially conceptual engineers. Okay? We work with concepts, and many puzzles are conceptual puzzles. And I'm going to give you one or two examples of simple conceptual puzzles. So, for example, the mirror puzzle. You look into a mirror every day and you don't think
Oh, please
twice
don't be
about
what I
it.
think this
But now
is.
think about this. Why do mirrors
It is
look
science in
like
terms
this?
of what's happening to the body. Well, okay, so like at that point, what you mean by what someone means by science, if they say that, is so broad that like fine, like literally anything. That said, I also thought of another example that I wasn't going to pause for because I didn't feel like going off that long. Um, but now I'm getting more pushback. All right, let's go. If you were playing poker, for example, and you say like, okay, like based on how they've behaved, I think their hand of cards is probably no better than this thing. You're actually like there's an amount of observation in terms of like what they've been doing, but it's not. I would call that closer to logic than science, right? And logic is a philosophical discipline. There's lots of these kinds of like you can maybe you're saying like maybe you can say like you've strung together enough observations to know that and it's kind of scientific, like okay sure, but then what isn't science, right? Literary analysis is science too, like everything is science, and at that point what are you really doing? That said, I also say science is part of philosophy, so point philosophy still, like if we're gonna just say like if it encapsulates, if we can make things so broad that it encapsulates everything, right, then science is part of philosophy. Checkmate the atheists, I guess.
Left to right, but not top to bottom. Why is that? It's a really hard puzzle. You'll find Plato thinking about that puzzle and failing to solve
Oh,
it.
it was the thing I thought it
Can
was. It was
science
like, why does a mirror reverse left to right but not top to bottom? And it's like the actual answer is that it doesn't do either. It inverts into and out of. It's like a weird way of thinking about the world. Like maybe you could say this is a philosophical thing. It's like reasoning, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a weird example.
solve that puzzle? The answer is no, it can't, because it doesn't matter how much scientific data you get in or how many scientific theories you develop about how light bounces off the surface of the mirror, the fact is that the light bounces off the surface of the mirror in exactly the same way, whether it's on this axis or in that axis. It makes no difference whatsoever. You can have as many scientific discoveries and as much scientific theorizing as you like, you will never solve that puzzle until you start thinking conceptually. It's a conceptual puzzle. If you want to solve that puzzle, you can do it from the comfort of your armchair. I'm not going to do it for you now. But you can do it from the comfort of your armchair. It's essentially something you can figure out with your eyes closed just by having a think about it. That's philosophy. That's what philosophy is. There are puzzles that are purely conceptual in nature that you need conceptual methods.
If I were going to try to argue with this, because I've heard this before, you could probably make a scientific argument for this, because you would need, because I don't know, like, without going over what his solution is, it's hard to know, like, how much you need observation and experimentation for, but, like, some of the solutions, some of the ways that you get in more information about this puzzle are things like, okay, like, don't do this with a mirror that's hanging on your wall, do this with, like, a hand mirror. Okay, it's reversing left and right, but now, like, turn it sideways. It seems to still do that, but like, the orientation of what's left and right and what's up and down has flipped. Clearly, that's not what it's doing, right? Science depends on a defined system. Once the system is defined, then one can make observations and conclusions. Yes, philosophy overlaps with this. Yeah, I guess. Or you could do the same thing with, like, take like, on a piece of paper, draw an arrow, and then point it at the mirror, and, like, notice it doesn't flip left and right. It flips which direction it's pointing into and out of. Or you can do, like, with a newspaper or whatever, you can see how the words go. There's, like, a lot of observation you can use to inform what's actually going on, and in a way it is hypothesis and experimentation to see, like, what's actually happening.
To solve. Again, here's another simple example. Suppose I were to say that might your brother's mother's sister be your nephew's father's wife?
He went over that too fast.
Do you need
I don't
to
know.
employ a scientist to answer that question? No. Do you need to engage in any kind of
So that is a question of
inquiry?
semantics, which
No,
I think
you can
is
figure out the
a
answer.
legitimate source of knowledge and understanding that is unique to philosophy.
When you can all think about it from the comfort of your armchair. There are plenty of puzzles that are essentially conceptual puzzles that are not scientific puzzles, that do not require the application of the scientific method in order for us to solve them. Those are the puzzles that we're focusing on. Another one, going all the way back to ancient Greece, is can you jump in the same river twice? Heraclitus wondered.
That's a rough one, because that one's
you might think,
very
well,
navel-gazy.
If I jump in and then I get out and then I jump in again and the water's moved a bit and the fish have pooed in the water and it's changed in various ways, so it's not the same river. And if it's not the same river, then the number of rivers, right, is 2, not 1. But that sounds wrong.
Yeah, and people have gone so far as to say you can't even jump in the same river once. This is, like, one of the most navel-gazy questions I've ever heard in philosophy, and, like, there's people have gone on at length for centuries about this question. I don't want to get into it.
Here's another reason why you can't jump in the same river twice. It won't be you that jumps in the second time, because you would have changed in the interim, no matter how short a period of time has elapsed. Change would have taken place, so it won't be the same person, therefore the number of people is 2. In other words, nothing ever changes, it just disappears and gets replaced by another thing that's very slightly different to it. Now that's an extraordinarily silly and absurd metaphysical conclusion generated by an argument that's got something wrong with it, right? How do you figure out what's wrong with the argument by doing empirical science? No, right? The way you figure out what's wrong with the argument is you sit in your armchair with your eyes closed and you start making conceptual distinctions, in this case, between different kinds of sameness or identity.
Yeah,
that argument...
This gets a little bit to semantics, which I think is under discussed. Right, what do we mean by two things are the same? It's the kind of thing that feels like we have an understanding of, but we brush up against when we find other conceptions of this. One of the ones I'm familiar with is that there are always these tales of, such and such group in, small society and wherever that have a tradition of telling the stories of their ancestors back, hundreds if not thousands of years, and there's one person whose job it is to remember it, and they tell it the same way every time. Well, it was such a fascinating thing because, obviously, like, how could they do that? That sounds so incredible. We want to see what's going on with that, and so, like, researchers went to go find out. Well, in the process, they recorded these people and found that no, they didn't tell it the same way every time. Not the way we think of the meaning of the same. See, we have other tools for recording other than memorizing a story that we use culturally. So things like writing it down, making a video, making an audio recording. We do lots of things. And so what we mean by the same is we mean identical. We mean word for word, sound for sound, exactly the same. But there's a version of sameness that is not quite when you don't have such identical such ways of recording things. Your concept of sameness might not be the same. You might say, you told the same story even if it's slightly different because you're capturing the essence of the story or like the major details that are important. It's kind of the same way a comedian might tell the same joke 50 times, but each time is a little bit different, but we call it the same. What we mean by sameness changes a lot. I just thought that was really interesting, so I wanted to blather a bit. But yeah, like this, it's a lot of this is like, what do we mean by sameness? And it's not so clear. Oh, and by the way, like, I want to like harken back to the debate yesterday. It's like identical, not different. Okay, but that type of an identical type, exactly similar. Well, clearly, we've already discussed several instances of us using the word same to mean very different. From this definition. Wait, isn't this definition useless because we don't learn the definition from here? Well, no, as we saw with the debate in the last couple of days, that's not how we understand words like this. We gain the understanding of it not from a dictionary, but from context and culture and being around people using the word, and eventually the definition is written to try to capture what we mean by it. Depends on how much you split the hairs. Yeah, exactly. And well, the thing is, where and how much you split hairs is cultural. We might not think of it as cultural, but it absolutely is. Again, like even in our own culture, identical. Like if I gave you two essays and I told you they were the same, but had like very different word structure, sentence structure, even if they were making the same arguments, like you probably wouldn't say they're the same, right? But we already went over like a comedian telling a joke 50 times but changing details here and there. You'll still call it the same joke because it's capturing the essence identically. We use these terms differently, and in the same way with, like, as we were talking about the last couple of days, the word woman or the word man, the definition is not how we understand how these words are, and we understand what people mean by it even if the definition doesn't capture the meaning entirely.
Trades on an ambiguity between two different ways of using the expression the same, and once you've spotted that, you go, well, of course, right? But until you've
zoomed in versus zoomed out, yeah, sure.
To draw some silly metaphysical conclusions. Again, philosophical progress. So that's what philosophers do, it seems to me. It seems to me that many of these are fairly trivial examples, but the mind-body problem is in essence a philosophical puzzle. It's a conceptual puzzle. Scientists may discover all sorts of facts about minds and brains and what goes on in one being correlated with something going on in the other and so on. But is the mind the brain or not? What's the connection between the two? There appears to be a philosophical
I mean, I would
puzzle
ask
there,
what
because
you
on
mean
one
by
hand,
the
it's
mind,
like
but
minds have to
probably
be
yes.
brain.
I would say I don't know. It seems like what else would it be? But I guess if you want to get really metaphysical with it, and like there's some sense of self that exists outside of the brain, I don't know that I buy that. Especially because you'll notice if your brain is damaged, your mind changes. It's not like these two things are independent of one another.
Or at least physical in order to have any physical effects. On the other hand, it seems they can't possibly be, because there seems to be some kind of conceptual obstacle to identifying minds with brains. I won't go into the detail.
There's a conceptual obstacle, but that's a cultural one. Yeah, I don't know. That's a bad example
in
my opinion.
If you want to solve that puzzle and show that minds are brains, you have to do conceptual engineering. You're going to have to employ a philosopher, because it's a philosophical, conceptual puzzle,
Maybe.
not a scientific puzzle. No matter how much science you do, you're never going to solve a conceptual puzzle. That is the mind-body problem. So it seems to me that, again, it's a properly philosophical puzzle. So it seems to me that philosophy is different to science, but that's not to say that philosophy is a waste of time. It's essentially conceptual engineering. It's important to have philosophers around.
I'm surprised he hasn't once mentioned
Very
ethics.
often, it doesn't even occur to the scientist to ask a philosophical question. It seems to me it's important to have philosophers around in the same way it's important to have trained magicians around.
Oh no, he did mention ethics. I'm mistaken. No, he did mention Izzard stuff. No,
right?
my bad.
Because when they investigate Uri Geller, they get tricked and they get fooled and they miss what any trained magician is going to spot in a minute, right? You need a different skill set when you're dealing with that kind of problem and that kind of claim, and scientists don't have that skill set, okay? Philosophy is similar in that it deals with certain kinds of problems, it employs certain kind of methods. You tend to find the same kind of problems cropping up again and again and again, and so as a philosopher you tend to get very good at dealing with those problems. That's what we do, okay? It's not science, it doesn't pretend to be science, but it is nevertheless, it seems to me, very important. I'll stop there.
This discussion is the fact that there are two genuinely opposing views. So what I'm going to do before I open up questions from the floor is I'm going to give each speaker a 5-minute comeback within less than 5 minutes.
Oh, it'd be nice if they had some like back and forth, but okay. Been spoiled by modern day debate. I like the back and forth sections.
Either the philosophers spend a lot of time saying you'll never be able to do something, or they spend their time on problems that have no relevance at all to the world. And you saw examples of that from
he's a little right, but
talk just now. Will scientists ever be able to talk about the origin of the world from absolutely nothing? Who knows? They are currently trying. And it's no point in saying, you will not ever do it. Let the scientists get on with the job of doing it. Will the scientists never be able to talk about the roots of morality?
well,
Of course they can talk about the roots of morality. What they have to do is to take the anthropological evidence, they have to take the ethological evidence, they have to take the evolutionary evidence, and they have to think about the way that we humans can think about the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, but I mean he was pretty clear about why that doesn't work, right? Like you will only be ever be answering is questions. What is the case? What has led to this? But that kind of information cannot tell you what ought to be, why it should be the case that like murder is wrong or whatever, that we consider murder wrong or whatever. And that seemed pretty clear. I'm surprised that he's like fighting against this is-ought distinction.
So the scientists are working on that other domain of philosophy, which philosophers are desperately trying to defend for themselves. They will fail. The scientists will expose the answers to these questions, and the philosophers will be left in yet smaller corner of the intellectual universe that they're currently painting themselves into. All the other problems about concepts.
This to me feels a little bit as an analogy when he's talking about like putting them in the philosophy will be relegated to even smaller corners of intellectual inquiry is kind of the sense of like the example I would use is someone living in a 10-bedroom house and they have all this space, but then they have a kid and they're like, well, I'll give you the kid one of the rooms, and then they have another kid and they'll give the kid another room, and they do that until they only have one room left in the house. It's like, look how little space you have. It's like, well, yeah, because I created all of you to fill this space, and like in a sense you are derived from me. I don't know. That's how it feels to me to be like, oh, you have so little space left to inquire. I was like, well, yeah, because like philosophy spun up all these disciplines to that didn't exist without their version philosophy's version of inquiry.
The philosophers spend their time on conceptual problems. I mean, that's empty. It's all about linguistics and people about applying.
But linguistics is important.
Words to particular things. It's a complete waste of time.
It's absolutely not a waste of time. What the hell?
And if we said that, did I look John?
Yeah, like, I don't know. Has this guy never encountered issues or like what we mean by stuff matters? I mean, this is in 2014. Gay rights had been very much on the forefront of people's minds by this point, and what we mean by the word marriage was very much a relevant question to answer. This wasn't trivial and a waste of time. This was extremely important, actually.
Into the River Thames twice, the answer would be perfectly clear. And I don't think there is any conceptualizing that except to keep sometimes philosophers in the jobs that they're trying to, in the face of all the evidence that they're trying to keep. So, although I think philosophers are wonderful people, it's certainly the case that almost all of them have wasted their time through the centuries. And currently, happily, they're migrating to that small intellectual corner of the universe where it doesn't matter what they say.
Except it does. Like, I don't know. This seems like weirdly obtuse. Like, there are lots of questions that a scientist could never answer that a philosopher could, right? Like, should people of different races have different rights? The answer should be obvious. No, there should be the same rights. But a scientist can't answer that question because it's a should question. They can only take it. There's a lot of like something I see scientists do a lot is they'll take their assumptions about the world as facts and kind of uncritically. So the philosopher might say, since people of different races are essentially the same from a biological perspective, then yes. But that's with their assumption that that biological sameness should be the distinguishing factor, right? They just don't interrogate that. But that's an odd question. Science can't answer that, but philosophy can.
Listen to them anymore. Stephen.
I feel like I'm going to bat for the philosophy exclusively here because one of the things I noticed is that the scientist will attack philosophy. The philosopher will not attack science, merely defend the validity of philosophy and say that science also has value. Lawrence Krauss might say that's because the value of science is unquestionable, but I take it more of like a kind of a. It looks like a posture to me, actually, that rather than a posture assumed by the scientist who argues in this way, as opposed to the philosopher just could not possibly attack sciences. I don't know. Something to think about.
It's a complete waste of time because it's conceptual. No, you can establish really important things by just doing a bit of armchair theorising. I mean, draw really big, important conclusions. So, for example, you can probably establish from the comfort of your armchair that there is no God, and conclusions don't become much bigger than that, it seems to me. Yes, you can. I've done it. Shall I explain it?
By the way, I agree that you can. Not just that you can dismiss all arguments for the existence, but you can actually. I think you can come to the conclusion that there is not. I'm not going to get into it here. Maybe if we do another theological debate, I'll express that there. But and that does have pretty big impact on people's lives, obviously.
It's also worth remembering that scientists themselves acknowledge the importance of conceptual work. So, for example, there is the famous thought experiment run by Galileo, who was a critic of the Aristotelian view.
I was going to mention, my example would have been Einstein with his thought experiment that led him to realize a contradiction, or what seemed to be a contradiction in the scientific understanding at the time, that he eventually solved with his theory of relativity.
Had the consequence that a large metal ball and a small metal ball, differing masses, would fall at different speeds depending on the mass. Okay, that was a consequence of the Aristotelian theory. And Galileo is supposed to have climbed the Tower of Pisa and thrown these two balls off to see what would happen. But actually, he probably didn't do that. And what he certainly did do was he ran a thought experiment. He said, imagine, a bit of conceptual work now, imagine the two balls are chained together, right? Now, if Aristotle's theory is true, how are they going to fall? Are they going to fall faster or slower at the same speed? You just combined their mass, so they must fall faster. However, the small ball being chained to the big ball, it previously fell slower than the big ball. It will be acting as a brake on the big ball. Therefore, the two balls must fall slower. So we've just derived a logical contradiction from Aristotle's theory of motion, which shows that Aristotle's theory of motion
Yeah,
is fixed. So we've
but
just
the
shown-
problem is
we don't know
the-
what's actually going to happen when you throw the balls off the top of that Tower of Pisa. You have to do some science to establish that, but you know in
Yeah, I
advance
guess that's fair. It can like
that
lead you
particular
to
scientific
scientific
theory is false,
questions,
and we've
which is what I was
established
saying
that
earlier.
by doing conceptual engineering. Okay, so even scientists do it, see the value of it.
Not a great
Um,
argument to say
but
that scientists do it. They might he
um,
might just say like, okay, they're engaging in a waste of time, that they shouldn't be doing it. But I think I think it's clear that philosophy has its value at this point. I'm not going to keep going on about it.
that this is all trivial and important, and also point to the fact that it's very often moral questions that we're interested in. It seems to me that these are some of the most important questions that there are. I've already explained why, if Hume is correct, you can never justify moral conclusions by reference to premises that concern what is the case, and those are the only premises that science is going to be able to deliver. Peter pointed to anthropology and ethnography and so on, various other scientific disciplines which he supposes might ultimately answer the question about the origin of morality, which would be very interesting and well worthwhile, but completely irrelevant because it wasn't the question
Yeah,
that I
okay,
raised, which is
yeah.
why a certain position's right or wrong, not why do we think certain positions are right or wrong. It may be a product of our
Yeah,
evolutionary
exactly.
heritage.
It is
We
Osgood.
think certain things are right and other things are wrong. That doesn't make them right or wrong. If you want to justify them as moral positions, you're going to need a different kind of argument, not the argument that Peter offered. I mean, what's striking is that Peter can't even see the difference between those two questions. He doesn't even...
Yeah, I do notice that scientists do that a lot, is they don't notice the distinction between these things. It's kind of, yeah. I mean, Krauss does that all the time when he rails against philosophy.
So now we'll take questions from the floor. Please wait for the mics to come to you. Please try and keep the questions short so we can get through as many people as possible. So can we begin with this lady over here, please?
It's a rather brief debate. Maybe we'll watch a little bit of the Q&A.
Well, I'm Dutch, so I'm blunt. And I'm going to say to you that for me, as the Vice Chancellor of Humanistic Studies...
Are Dutch people known for being blunt? I
University
didn't
of
know
Humanistic
that.
Studies, this is a very outdated kind of discussion, I think, because...
Agreed.
It is so... Why are you so in the opposition to each other? For instance, Peter, you are talking about truth and finding truth, but you know that truth only exists within a paradigm. And you jump from paradigm to paradigm. So, where's then the truth? And for instance, let me give you an explanation. At my university, we are working on research on aging well and how to do that. And there are many people working on this kind of research. There are medical people that are trained in medicine. So they're trying to...
Actually, I thought I just had, because remember the question is whether science or philosophy is better for free inquiry. The observation that the scientist is delegitimizing philosophy, but the philosopher is not doing the same, makes it pretty clear that philosophy is more open to free inquiry, in that they're saying that the philosopher is able to say both are good avenues of inquiry, but the scientist says no, only science is. That's actually kind of funny. Just their posture in the debate demonstrates the answer.
How you grow old healthy. And there are socialists working on aging well, and they try to find out what aging means in society in the coming years.
This is an exceptionally long
there
question.
Are people, ethicists working on
She has
aging
notes,
well, because
goddamn.
in the end, we are all growing old, and we will need help. So there is conceptual thinking, and philosophers and ethicists are also working in that.
I don't know if she knows that she wasn't invited to be a speaker. She's just asking a question. What the hell?
When we want to advance in the future, we'll have to work together a lot more than saying to each other, this is science and this is not science. And I have a question for you, Stephen. Do you call yourself a scientist?
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry. It is so funny to me that it's like, here's my 2-minute question for the scientist. I think his name is Peter. I think that's Peter Atkins. Yeah, for Peter. Here's like my 2 minutes, and it's all this like ins and outs, and like I lost track of what she was talking about 3 times or whatever. And then for Stephen, here's my 4-word question. There you go. It takes 3 seconds to say. Let's go.
Sure.
Yeah.
No. No, I don't call myself a scientist, but I think...
You have a follow-up? don't. Okay, I'm sorry. This is like absurd. Like I don't know how someone's just like, yeah, this is reasonable that I can go on at
I
length
think
and
we
have
should
my
look into
follow-ups and
calling
whatever.
it scientists, because we had this conversation, and I explained, like what I think I'm doing, and he says, "Oh yeah, that's all great, but why call it philosophy?" And I said, "Why am I just a scientist then?" His answer was yes, as far as I can remember. I don't really care what you call it. But it seems to me that what I am doing is a perfectly legitimate and worthwhile activity, and it seems to me that it would be highly misleading to call it science because it
Yeah,
is
it's relevantly different than how science operates for sure.
Peter doesn't like about it.
There are a lot of empirical philosophers.
Well, back to aging, of course your studies there have to be evidence-based. I don't see that philosophers are going to help you very much in sorting out an understanding of aging. What you've got to do is to be aware of the physical changes that are taking place in minds and bodies. I'll concede that, you see. And act accordingly. You don't need philosophers to help you. They'll just muddy the water.
That's not true. That is sometimes
She's trying to argue with him now. Oh my God,
There was,
lady.
earlier on in the question, there was a comment about truth being relative to paradigms. That I suspect that would have set Peter right off, and me also. but perhaps we should. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back.
Okay, it's down to the classes.
I too worry about what we're worrying about. I think that we tend to be quite pretty clear what science is. We're perhaps less clear what philosophy is. The characterization that I like the most, because I think they might be unhappy, is that it's dealing with the problems that nothing else can deal with at the time.
Yes.
Now, if you look at it in that way, I think you can see that Peter Atkins is probably being rather harsh when he says that science has gradually taken over all the areas of philosophy, so it shows that philosophy is a failure. Actually, that shows that philosophy is a success. It wasn't that there were a bunch of scientists who came on.
Why are people arguing? Just ask your question.
Who said to do philosophy worked up to the point where you could begin to tackle it in a scientific way.
Maybe it's a different
I
cultural
suspect we'll
expectation in this
constantly
setting. I don't know.
see that sort of development where
I mean, I agree with him,
yes,
but-
subjects that you cannot deal with, science cannot deal with at any one time, will be able to deal with at a later time. And philosophy will move
Is
on
the
from
rest of
that.
this just Q&A? It seems like the rest of this is just Q&A.
But that is effectively what I was saying, that the progress in science, evidence-based interaction.
Yeah, okay, the rest of this is Q&A.
Has gradually removed the need for philosophy. It's moved into the domains that were once regarded by philosophy as its own. And it's fine, the fact that that's true also of theology, that modern science has eliminated most of theology by showing that evidence-based inquiry can explain rather than obfuscate. And I'm sure that Steve agrees with that.
I'm absolutely with you on the fact that philosophy once used to encompass a great deal more territory.
Yeah.
The empirical sciences, of course.
When we understood
also
lies,
under,
yeah.
Philosophy's umbrella. I also would certainly be sympathetic to the view that just because we can't understand how something could be the case, therefore, well, science will never explain it. Then, we can't understand how inanimate matter could become animate without sprinkling some supernatural fairy dust on the thing in question. Well, now we know that that's not the case. In fact, scientists can explain how it is that inanimate matter can indeed become animate. So we shouldn't be too pessimistic about what science can establish. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that there are puzzles that are essentially conceptual in nature. And I gave you several examples right at the beginning. They're clearly conceptual puzzles, and it clearly...
Those are
Well,
bad,
then let's call them
mostly
linguistic
bad
then.
examples, but
If you like, then I'll be a linguistic philosopher. I'm not entirely sure they're entirely linguistic, but certainly in many cases they are linguistic. And in which case, it seems to be that this is, again, very important work. It's worth focusing on those kind of conceptual puzzles, in part because they are very often moral puzzles, and so very often people will walk past these problems without even noticing that there was a problem or a puzzle there. You need a certain amount of kind of conceptual awareness even to spot that there is some kind of difficulty.
Yeah, I think that really the only domain left for philosophy is moral philosophy. Really.
Oh no, very much disagree. Moral philosophy,
Explication
political philosophy, I guess that's like a subsection. Semantics, epistemology. Like there's a lot of logic. I don't think all the work is done on logic.
For example, in order to achieve an aim. Very deep philosophical questions which no computer can yet answer.
Okay, we're gonna cut it there. The Q&A seems pretty boring, and like people asking absurdly long questions or just arguing with them. Pretty brief debate, but it was interesting, and I'm glad it was brief. I don't want to go too much longer anyway. If you are unsure as to what my thoughts are, then clearly I haven't talked enough, which can't be the case. So hopefully everyone's on board of where I land on this. Yeah, I think both science and philosophy are necessary in their own ways and have value in their own ways. It is odd to me that scientists will sometimes seem not to understand this very often, or at the very least that a significant number of them seem to dismiss philosophy outright. At the very least, Peter Atkins and Lawrence Krauss. I don't know who else does. But no, philosophy still has its value. As we saw, I mean, just yesterday, or as we do on this channel all the time, we're constantly doing philosophy, and hopefully the value of doing that is very clear. So I'm going to cut off a little bit early, in part because I also have I've got somewhere to be. I didn't do a 4th of July thing yesterday. I'm doing it today. I don't understand why, but made some iced tea for it. I'm very excited, and so I got to get ready for that. But thank you all so much for watching. Very much appreciate Peachy Keen. That's un-American. Is it un-American, or is it the most American? I'm rebelling against the notion that I should do what the state said. I don't know. I got nothing. But hey, I'm still doing. I sometimes want to call it J4, but one, League of Legends is a champion who gets referred to as J4, but also people call January 6th J6, and so I don't want to like conflict. So I'm still doing the Independence Day thing. All right, let it not be said yet that I'm un-American. I do have some sentiments that might be considered un-American, but I don't know. For the most part. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Thanks all so much for watching. I am interested in Green Flag. I don't know if you're still in chat or if you're going to watch back or whatever else. I am very interested on this thing you were talking about with Sam Harris's version of humanism. Maybe I'll look into it on my own if you don't send me anything. But since you know what you're talking about, it would be better if you could send me something about that, because that does sound very interesting. I'd be happy to go over it, see what I think. Sam Harris. Say what you will about him, he is at the very least an interesting person. I have a lot of disagreements with his positions, but he is very, very definitely interesting, to say the least. So I'd be happy to talk about him. Maybe we could do that tomorrow, honestly. So if you hit me up with that, either in the chat here is not going to be helpful after I end stream, but in the comments, or you can email me at earnestengagement@gmail. Hit me up with that, and I'll be happy to watch it. But thanks all so much for watching. It was a little bit briefer today, but that's all right. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one. Bye.